Olá, olá a todos, bem-vindos. Hello everyone, welcome. Okay, so we will start now with the conversation with Anthony Marra. First of all, thank you for being here. For FLAD, we are very happy to be able to continue this cycle, Meet the Author, that we started last year. And first we had Colson Whitehead, and then we had Joshua Yaffa, and then Samantha Rose Hill, and now we have Anthony Marra here with us. And we are very happy to have you, and because this is a great opportunity for us to be able to know a little better American writers and to have the opportunity to listen them, to tell their stories, and also to have the opportunity to put questions in the end. So I would also like to thank Isabel Lucas, that has been with us in this cycle from the beginning, and she will be conducting the conversation. So thank you all, and let's hear you too. Thank you.
Olá, boa tarde. Hello, good evening. It's my pleasure to have here Anthony Marra. I asked him to read a few pages of his last novel, just arrived last year in US and UK and all countries of English language. But first of all, I want to present him for those who yet don't know him. Anthony Marra was born and raised in Washington, D.C. in 1984. That's true?
It is true.
He started to be familiar with the word war when his father told him about his experience in Vietnam War. 50 years ago.
50 years ago.
Now, yeah.
Yeah.
Later, in his late teens, another war came into his life, his home, the War of Terror. The city was filled with the sound of sirens, and he felt a new fear. How to shape the narratives he grew up with into the collective story he was now witnessing. The idea haunted him. He studied literature at university and soon after moved to St. Petersburg to study Russian literature. Putin was only a short time in power. The war in Chechnya in the order of the day. He spent a month in the Arctic territory, and from that experience, his first novel, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, was born. It was in 2013. The book won several awards and received critical acclaim. Anthony Marra was only 29 years old. In 2017 came out the volume of short stories, The Czar of Love and Tecno, a kind of younger brother of the previous book, now in the format of a mixtape. It was the war again, the absurdity of war, the suffering, the loss of identity, the circularity of the tragic across generations, and irony as the last stronghold of those who have nothing left. The book was published the following year in US, as I say, but will be here in Portugal, maybe in the end of this year, with by Porto Editora. This is a new information, and now we are here to talk about this book. But also about the Czar and the Love and Tecno. This is the only book that we have in Portuguese edition. It's there to be buy and read. In this last book, he returned in this last novel. It calls Mercury Pictures Presents. He is still with war, but he started with a new thing in his career, a kind of autobiographical. I'm sorry, this is difficult to say. Autobiographical experience. This is the book that we are expecting here in Portugal to have, and now Anthony is going to read something just for us to be familiar with his writing. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you so much. Thank you Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to Flad for having me. This is an absolute treat, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm just going to read the first couple of pages of this new novel, Mercury Pictures Presents. It's set in Hollywood in the 1940s, and it sort of emerged out of my last book, The Czar of Love and Tecno, which is, among other things, about the legacy of propaganda and censorship in the Soviet Union. And while I was researching that, I began to get interested in what America was doing in a similar, at a similar time period, which led to this exploration of Hollywood and propaganda in the war. So I'll just read 2 pages right from the beginning of the book. When you entered the executive offices of Mercury Pictures International, you would first see a scale model of the studio itself. Artie Feldman, co-owner and head of production, installed it in the lobby to distract skittish investors from second thoughts. Complete with backlot, sound stages, and facility buildings, the miniature was a faithful replica of the 10-acre studio in which it sat. Maria Lagana, as rendered by the miniaturist, was a tiny, featureless figure looking out of Artie's office window. And this was where the real Maria stood late one morning in 1941, hands holstered on her hips, watching as a pigeon autographed the windshield of her boss's new convertible. She would like to buy that bird a drink. "It's a beautiful day out, Art," Maria said. "You really should come take a look." "I have," Artie said. "It made me want to jump." Artie wasn't known for his joie de vivre, but he usually didn't fantasize about ending it this close to lunch. Maria wondered if the Senate investigation into motion picture war propaganda was giving him agita. But no, the crisis at hand was on his head. His bald spot had finally grown too large for his toupee to conceal. 6 other black toupees were shellacked atop wooden mannequin heads on the shelf behind his desk, where a more successful producer might display his Oscars. They were conversation starters, as in, Artie began conversations with new employees by telling them the toupees were the scalps of their predecessors. As far as Maria could tell, the 6 hair pieces were the same indistinguishable model and style. But Artie had become convinced that each one crackled with the karmic energy of the hair's original head, unrealized and awaiting release, like a static charge smuggled in a fingertip. Thus, he had named his toupees after their personalities: the heavyweight, the Casanova, the optimist, the Edison, the Odysseus, and the Mephistopheles. Artie had never felt more at home in his adoptive country than when he learned the founding fathers had all worn toupees, even that showboat John Hancock. The only one who hadn't was Benjamin Franklin. And look how he turned out. A syphilitic Francophile who got his jollies flying kites in the rain. "Maybe the toupee shrunk," he said, still hoping for a miracle. "I think you'll need one with more coverage, Art," Maria said. "That's the 2nd time this year," Artie said. "Christ, when will it end?" Maria said, "Life's nasty and brutish, but at least it's short." I'll stop there.
Thank you. This is a very more Brighton pages that we have across, comparing with Czar. But there is a connection between those books and between the 3 books, I guess, the Phenomena, the Mercury, and this Czar. What is the connection besides the war?
I think that each book in different ways is interested in how culture shapes politics and how then politics reframe cultural debate. I think in my first book, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, it was interested in the actual writing of history. There was a character in that who has been trying to write a history of Chechnya for his entire life. And every time he gets close to finishing a draft of this massive history, a change in the prevailing political winds in Moscow means that he has to rewrite everything to adhere to the new political realities. In The Czar of Love and Tecno, this interest in the intersection of culture and politics came through the first character that we meet in the book, who is a trained portrait artist who, during Stalin's reign, is assigned to erase the faces of dissenters, and so this man who has been educated and sort of believes in the beauty and the importance of creating likenesses of human faces is instead charged with erasing them. In this last book, Mercury Pictures Presents, it's a question of how Hollywood became enmeshed in America's propaganda machine during the war, and particularly the ways in which emigres and exiles who fled from Europe to LA. There were about 10,000 refugees who were living in LA in the early 1940s. How those individuals responsible for movies like Casablanca that really shaped both how America saw itself and how the world saw America were themselves classified as enemy aliens by the U.S. government and were denied the very rights and freedoms that their movies championed. So I think all three of these books are sort of interested in looking at how politics are shaped by culture and how culture is shaped by politics.
I mentioned that this book is more biographical. I don't know how to say the word, I'm sorry. But can you tell us at which point there is autobiography here? Because it was a thing that you tried for the first time in your career.
Yeah, so with my first two books, I really saw them as almost the relationship between a reporter and a journalistic subject, where I intentionally tried to remove as best I could myself from the work and from the pages. And with this book, for the first time, I did try to root around a bit in my own family's history and their lives, for lack of a better term. So this book began for me back in 2014, and my first two books each took around 2 years to write. And so when I started this last one in 2014, I figured I would be done while Barack Obama was still in office, and little did I know. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., but I've lived most of my adult life in California. My wife is from Los Angeles, and this period of LA history has always really appealed to me. So I'd been kicking around an idea about a novel set in that world. And at the same time, I was also thinking about writing a book set in southern Italy, where my dad's side of the family emigrated from. And so for a number of months, I was going back and forth between the Los Angeles novel and the Italy novel, never sort of able to settle on one. And things finally came together when I went to a small island called Lipari, which is off the coast of Sicily, one of the Aeolian Islands. And this is where my great-grandmother's family emigrated from. And on one of our last days there, we saw this little plaque on sort of mounted to a castle wall that was commemorating the anti-fascists and artists and intellectuals who had been sentenced to internal exile by Mussolini's regime to this little island. And it seemed utterly surreal. I had never heard of this particular chapter in the island's history before. And it just seemed bizarre that this place to which I could trace my own roots had been Mussolini's Alcatraz. And that was the point where I remembered something that German and Austrian exiles in Los Angeles, a term that they would use to describe Los Angeles, and that was sunny Siberia. And it struck me that the same term could have been applied just as easily to this island leapery in the middle of the Mediterranean. And that was the moment when I realized that this book would be about these two sunny Siberias on either end of the world, and realizing that I actually had a genealogical connection to one of these places sort of allowed me to introduce some of my own, the cast of characters from my own life into the book. So the main character, Maria, who we are briefly introduced to in that section that I just read, she fled Italy as a child with her mother, and they live in Los Angeles with her three great aunts, who are inspired by and named after my own great aunts. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the Czar. It is simplify a lot to say, just to say that is a volume of short stories. Is more than that. It was published here, as I guess I mentioned, by Teorema in 2017. And there is a sentence there that says something like, "The future is a lie with which we justify the brutality, the brutality of the present time." This was written 8 years ago, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look at these words now at 2023?
I think that it's never a good sign when a book about authoritarian encroachment becomes topical. As you said, I wrote this book. It was published in the U.S. in 2015, and I wrote most of it from probably 2009 to 2013 or so. And so I was working at a time when a lot of the perhaps the themes that resound more today seemed entirely historical. I think that one of the there is a line in the new book, Mercury Pictures presents, that a character says essentially that the future is entirely known. It's the past that is unpredictable. And I think that in authoritarian political systems, there is a sense that the future is known, and the sense that we can the sense that the possibilities of the future justify whatever depredations we undertake in the present to achieve them is something that clearly links the two books, and clearly is something that certainly in America has become increasingly relevant to our own political discourse.
Mm-hmm. As I told in the beginning, you are a son of a Vietnam War veteran, and the war was part of your life very early in your age, with all the stories that your father told you. To what extent have these narratives shaped your literature? Can you?
Yeah, so my dad went to Vietnam in the Army as a young person. He joined the Army in order to pay for college, since college was then, as it is now in the States, quite expensive. And he was there for a couple of years, and his time there always to me sounded like something out of Catch-22, as this very absurd, pointless endeavor. And it certainly marked his life and his way of looking at how governments conduct foreign policy and all of that. But just as a little kid, I remember just being both fascinated and horrified by the things that he might have seen or participated in or witnessed at a relatively young age, and I think that that ended up being something that was drawn into my work, and insofar as my first two books are pretty unautobiographical in terms of their material, I think the initial impetus to write them was in some respect to maybe get a bit closer or understand better my dad.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us that episode of Full Metal Jacket of Público?
Yeah. So when I was 5 years old, one of my friends of mine in the local kindergarten.
Kubrick in kindergarten.
In kindergarten, yeah. He had found a copy of Full Metal Jacket that I guess his parents had been had taken out from the local video store, and we decided to watch it. I remember just being, obviously horrified. And it's not really, an age-appropriate movie for a 5-year-old. But
you saw it all.
Oh yeah. And that year I'm not sure if it was. I can't remember what the context was, but I was drawing pictures of the various scenes from Full Metal Jacket. It got me a swift referral to the school psychiatrist. Yeah.
One of the themes of the book, I'm bizarre again, is the relation between the version of history and the totalitarian regimes, as you said. Another theme has taken on a new dimension in the global political agenda now, with the resurgence of the totalitarian threat all over the world, including the US. It is inevitable not to talk about it now. What comment, besides the literary one, does this temptation of manipulating history deserves to you?
I think that one of the things I sort of am always wary of as a reader, and as a writer is the ways in which historical fiction tends to look at the past with a great degree of nostalgia. And I think that as a writer, I'm trying to write against nostalgia in different ways. And I think that one of the ways I try to do that is by looking at the ways that history becomes fictionalized by political actors. And so all three of my books sort of examine that to various extents. And I think that history is where a lot of our ideological battles are take place. Over the last couple years in America, issues, controversies over Confederate monuments is one example where quite literally monuments to the past become these very contested spaces because what does that say about our values today if we are venerating, people like Robert E. Lee? I think that across Europe, across Latin America, across the world, history becomes a way of negotiating the political and ideological tensions today and trying to validate or disprove those tensions.
Mhm. You mentioned already you made a comparison between your craft in the beginning of the writing with the craft of a journalist. And I know that Anna Politkovskaya had a great influence in what you write and the way you look at people and try to describe the routines, the daily life. Tell me in which way you approach the work of writers and journalists like Anna, and the more literary names like Gogol, like Tolstoy, that are also an influence to you.
Yeah, so Anna Politkovskaya, for those who aren't familiar with her work, I highly recommend picking up some of her collected reportage. I hear that they've recently been translated into Portuguese. She was a writer that I came to early on when I started studying in St. Petersburg. I arrived in Russia about 3 months after she was assassinated. In large part because of the work she had done in Chechnya and because of her very strong anti-Putin stance. And one of the things that I found just so remarkable in her work is, not simply the moral courage that it took for her to write the way she did at that place in that time, despite the myriad threats to her life that sadly were ultimately acted upon. Not just like the moral courage, but simply in terms of her craft as a writer. She writes with so much compassion for her subjects, regardless of whether she's writing about Chechen refugees or the mothers of Russian soldiers. She really tries to bring out the humanity of whatever interview subject that she is talking to, and she does that in a way that makes them feel so vital. So her most famous book in the U.S. at least is called A Small Corner of Hell, and it begins the very first section relates this account of these refugees leaving Chechnya, this line of cars that come under attack from Russian soldiers. And there is a guy, among them a refugee, who has a clipboard. And he's been carrying around this clipboard for the last several months because he's convinced that no sniper will kill him because they'll think he's a bureaucrat, and nobody can be a terrorist and a bureaucrat. So, clearly this will save him. Mm-hmm. And it starts this sort of this conversation between him and several other people that it feels like it comes out of Samuel Beckett or something, where they are just sort of marveling at how absurd their world has become, how far from the realm of realism and their lives have veered. And the fact that this is how she introduces us to this world, but also to these specific characters, not with overly gruesome, overly grim, but this moment of pure absurdity in which her characters retain their personalities, their sense of irony, all of that, really had a big influence on me. In looking at other writers, I think that, a scene like that would fit very comfortably within Gogol's, body of work. I think that there is, a wonderful strain of absurdity throughout Russian literature that I think both from Gogol to Politkovskaya, various writers have availed themselves of.
Mm-hmm. It's the absurdity that allows the humor or the irony, the absurdity of the war.
I think that comedy is how absurdity articulates itself. That it is through comedy that absurdity kind of can become known to us, and so that's one of the reasons that my works are often have a degree of humor and comedy to them, even if they're dealing with serious subjects. Someone once described me as a comic writer who writes who only writes like tragedies, and I've always kind of liked that description.
You took us to a city. I know it's a small city in the Arctic. I'll try to say correctly the name.
Kirovsk.
Kirovsk. What took you there, and can you describe that? Because it's a place of very feeric. There's a kind of place of desolation, a place of from everybody wants to go away. What took you there, and what remains from you?
Yeah, so this is one of the main settings in the Czar of Love at Tecno. It's called Kirovsk, and it's based on a tiny city in northern Siberia above the Arctic Circle, called Norilsk, which was founded as a gulag labor camp, and it has, over the generations, people, former gulag inmates, resettled there, former guards, remained, and multiple generations on, it's become this place that people are trying to leave and yet return to continually, in part because it has a very prosperous and very environmentally hazardous nickel mine as the main business there, and I saw it as this place in which I could write about an entire within this microcosm of this one town. You could see this entire sweep of Russian history, where it begins as a labor camp under Stalin, and today, it's run by an oligarch. And within this one town, you could capture just the ways in which certain patterns have repeated themselves over the course of Russian history. So that's what drew me to that as a setting, was as a sort of landscape for looking at the larger historical sweep of 20th century Russia.
Mm-hmm. And this city crosses all the book. That has a form of a mixtape. Can you tell us why did you decide to give this form to the book? Because it's a short story book, but it's not only a short story book. It has a tiny connection with all the stories.
Yeah, so it's the book is as you said, structured as a mixtape. As a child of the 90s, I loved making mixtapes. I made mixtapes for everybody I ever had a crush on, and one of the things that I always loved about mixtapes is that you were trying to tell a larger story with a mixtape. That it's not just a bunch of random songs that you're that you're putting on your. I had a boom box with the dual cassette. It was very cool. It's not just a bunch of random songs you're putting on there. You're selecting them in a particular order, and there's certain thematic links that create a larger arc out of the individual songs that you're telling. So the Czar of Love and Techno, I wanted to structure as a mixtape, in part because of that, and also because so short stories in I'm not sure what the case is in Portugal, but in American literary culture, short stories are don't receive a lot of love.
Same here.
Same here?
Yeah.
All right. We sort of tend to see them as what young writers do on their way up, or what established writers do when they're feeling a bit lazy, or just phoning it in. And I remember after I published my first book, people would come up and they would say, "What are you working on now?" And I'd say, "A short story collection," and just see the hope drain from their from their eyes. It got me thinking about the fact that so much of what people maybe have reservations about when it comes to short story collections, the fragmentation, the sense of not maintaining a sort of linear plot, all of that those might be aspects that actually allow you to tell a narrative that is larger in scope than anything that I could do in a traditional novel. And so I began sort of thinking about this book as a way of trying to use the supposed shortcomings of a short story collection to tell a unified narrative that was more substantial than something I could do in a novel. So I almost see this book as one that begins as a short story collection and it ends as a novel.
And it has you made a soundtrack. I don't know if you can call something like that a soundtrack for this book.
I wish I could. My the marketing department at my American publisher made me
yeah.
made me make it after I finished. Yeah.
And what guided you to make that soundtrack? Because it isn't a kind of it's not a soundtrack with techno music,
no.
as the title can take us. What is that soundtrack?
It was it was something for I was interviewed on NPR and they somebody at my publisher thought that this would be a sort of nice thing for them to play.
It works?
It worked.
Okay.
It plays in the background.
Let's talk about literature in another way. You went to study Russian literature to St. Petersburg, and you said something like that you think that Russian literature is more profound than American literature. I would like you to explain in which way and why do you consider that, and if you still consider that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would say more profound, but maybe more sincere about its own philosophy. So among the generation that directly preceded me, I'm 38 years old. So the generation of writers directly ahead of me who were the people that when I was in college and in graduate school, the ones that I was looking at, it would have been people of David Foster Wallace's in his mode, I would say, and one of the things that I always found really moving about Russian literature as maybe opposed to the very hip, very sort of cynical writing that I think sort of has maybe come into vogue over the last 15 years is the sincerity with which they ask questions about, like, how do we live a good life? What is the what is the way to live ethically in a world that rarely rewards ethical behavior? How do we forgive each other? How do we die with dignity? All of these questions that I think that maybe writers of my generation or the generation preceding me has treated with a degree of suspicion, I think, as if we're maybe skeptical of the very sincerity with which they're asked. And so I think there's something about the ways in which these great Russian writers from the 19th century still feel relevant, that they're still read. It's because they're asking questions that feel as urgent today as they did in the 1870s.
And let's talk about language. There is a character in one of those stories who already in the post-Soviet regime, in a time when we called there is a new Russia, he feels like he cannot free himself from the Soviet vocabulary. It doesn't know how to live in a new country, with the new words, with a new thought, with a new environment. It doesn't have that language. He is a prisoner. He feels like a prisoner. I would like you to comment this in the way in which language could be a way of being free, but also a way of being recluse.
Yeah. I mean, I think that as a writer and even more importantly as a reader, I often sort of grew up to sort of see language as something that was essentially liberating, that it allows us to express ourselves and to communicate with people and to find affinities across time and space. And one of the things that I became sort of fascinated with in contemporary Russia is the ways in which, particularly in the decade following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where for a certain generation, their not only their framework for looking at the world, but also the very language that they used to interpret and articulate the world as they knew it was so shaped by Soviet ideology that once the Soviet Union was no more, there was a sense of feeling that you couldn't even find the words to express your innermost thoughts, because those words themselves had been proven to be lies, and I found that to be just a fascinating and tragic way of looking at how politics shapes language and what happens once the political molders of that language cease to exist. What happens to that language and to those for whom it is the mother tongue.
Mm-hmm. You were there when this new Russia was starting to was rising, and you also were there when when you put a character in that period of time, comparing Putin with Lord Voldemort. I would like you to look at all these years that passed and thinking about the expectations of people, about what means this, the expectations about what must be this new Russia and this Putin, this character, Putin.
Yeah. So I think that when Putin came to power, it was after one of the most, difficult decades in Russia's history in the 20th century, and obviously that is saying something. The ways in which free markets were introduced into Russia in the 90s were disastrous in terms of how it affected pensioners and ordinary people. The whole rise of oligarchs was largely the result of how state industries were auctioned off in that period. You had the ruble crisis, which wiped out the life savings of many people. You had the first war in Chechnya. So the 90s were a very tumultuous decade in Russia. And after that, Putin comes to power. And he is seen for much of the 2000s as being this break from the tumultuousness of Yeltsin and the 1990s. And he's viewed as in media, in Russian media, and in sort of the popular conscience, is viewed as being this very competent manager. This was also the period where a lot of sort of American corporate speak entered the Russian language, and manager is one of those terms that you see over and over again in terms of how Putin is described. And I think that there was this idea that the ordinary citizen would give up a few rights, a few freedoms, but in exchange they would receive a much more stable life and much more security. And I think for most of the 2000s and into the early and most of the 2010s, I think that the majority of Russian citizens were, if not okay with that arrangement, were willing to live with it. And I think, obviously, over the last 12 months, but going back to the invasion of Crimea, I think that we see that the Putin, the competent manager, was perhaps disguising Putin, the ideologic, the autocratic ideologue, and the megalomania that we see in how he has conducted foreign policy, in terms of how he sees himself as a world historic figure on par with Peter the Great, how he wants to reconstitute, the lost Russian Empire. All of those are qualities that he at least disguised much better in his early tenure, and I think now that the mask has slipped, now that his megalomania is in full bloom, I think that many Russians are probably finding that they traded their certain freedoms and liberties for security and stability, but now they have neither.
As you read while you write, you told me that. You mentioned also that Anna Politkovskaya was an influence, also unpatched, but also José Saramago.
Mm-hmm.
In which way, how did you find José Saramago, and in which way it was an influence to you, and or is an influence to you as a writer?
Yeah, I first read Saramago probably in I was probably in college when I first read him, and
what book?
The first one of his I read was Blindness, I believe, and that started my long love affair with him. I love the way in which many of his books begin as sort of a small thought experiment. What if there was an epidemic of blindness? What if the Iberian Peninsula began to float into the sea? What if a proofreader changed one word in a history book and it ends up changing history itself? And from these little, these sort of high concept, conceits, he is able to create these works that I feel like just plumb, the depths of what it is to be a person. And he just has such a light touch in terms of how he draws characters, how he moves in terms of his narrative. I think his actual his narrative stance, the way he has this sort of these omniscient narrators that are all told use the first person plural. I've heard it described as a story being told by a handful of old men around a card table, which I've always loved. But yeah, I think there are those authors that you keep rereading because you can't exactly articulate what it is about them that so speaks to you. And so you keep reading them, hoping to find out. And I think he's one of those few authors for me.
I have much more questions to Anthony, but I guess it's time to open to the audience. So it's your time to make questions to Anthony.
First one's always tough.
There's over there.
Hi, Anthony. How are you? 4 years ago, when we met in the Azores and we were talking about the craft of writing, you wondered if now there are so many novelists are writing for TV series, and the TV series achieved, some of them, a level of literary quality. You wondered if the profession of a novelist would turn just like what poetry is today. So a very niche production for a very niche audience. So my question is, how's the life of a novelist working out for you?
It's a great question. I think that in some respects maybe the pandemic has saved literature. That so many people started who weren't readers prior to the pandemic began reading. Because they realize there's only so many Netflix shows you can watch, and so I've been heartened by. I mean, I'm not sure what it is here in Portugal, but I've been heartened by how there are more independent bookstores in the U.S. now than there were 10 years ago. I believe book sales are stronger now than they were 10 years ago. So I think literary culture, at least in the U.S., is maybe still on life support, but there's still a heartbeat. There's still hope. For me, I've been fortunate in terms of having in the States, there's just like more readers than there are in a country like Portugal, which makes sustaining a sort of career as a writer a bit more attainable, just because there's a bigger market, and we also teach creative writing in universities, so it's much easier to find work as a professor as well. So between the two of those, things have been okay, but I'm still waiting for Hollywood to call for that lucrative TV work. Yeah.
Hi. In the Czar of Love and Techno, so you have this great central image. of the erasure of identity, and then your interest in Chechnya. So there's this obvious question of now, how do you see this in light of the recent ordeal of Ukraine? And similarities and differences, maybe you could take us through a quick cultural compare-contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in one of the things that that has been so strange over the last couple of the last year or so has been to see all of these parallels between particularly the second war in Chechnya. So there were these two wars, one from 94 to 96, and then one from 99 to 2001, 2002. And it was that second war was the one that Putin was largely responsible for, and he used this war in 1999 and 2000 to consolidate power both within the Kremlin and build a base of support in Russia at large. So that war was really central to how Putin rose to power, and is arguably without that conflict we perhaps wouldn't even remember his name today. And it seemed like he clearly learned the lessons that war had taught him in terms of how to sort of maintain control of the home front, and essentially use foreign conquest to consolidate domestic support. And I think that in terms of, there's all sorts of different, obviously, religious and cultural differences. The most important difference, I think, is that, obviously, Ukraine is its own sovereign country, whereas Chechnya was a republic within Russia. And so from, purely a geopolitical standpoint, I think that places them in very different situations. But in terms of like how the Russian army has engaged in this war in terms of just the sheer brutality, the terrorizing of civilians, the creation of what are called filtration camps, that Ukrainian men are sent to, the use of mercenaries, the entire Wagner group is in some ways modeled on the kinds of contract soldiers that were used to fight in Chechnya. So I think that there are a lot of similarities. What I think is very different in this instance, though, is how the world has reacted. There was this real sense during the Second Chechen War that certainly America and the West at large was primarily not interested in commenting or dealing with it. This became all the more so after 9/11, when Putin agreed to help George Bush conduct the war on terror, and in exchange for that, Washington decided not to comment on the war in Chechnya. So now, of course, much of the world has rallied behind Ukraine and has really, I think, put Russia in a box in terms of sanctions. So I hope at least that this conflict has a much different ending than the Chechen conflict.
No more questions?
Hi. You, as far from your bio, you went to St. Petersburg to study Russian literature, and from there, your love of Russia and Russian history, and that is so much present in your books. And you have already spoken about the differences between the Russian literature and the American literature in general. But my question really is, how did you become so interested? What was the trigger for you to interest you so much in Russian literature that you decided to go there and study it? And second question, what books do you recommend from Russian literature?
It's a very good question. It's a question my parents have asked over the years quite a bit. And you know, one of my early memories is of my parents listening to the Berlin Wall come down on the radio, and then a couple years later watching the red flag come down over the Kremlin. So much of my life has been has unfolded in sort of the this era of the end of history, or what has been referred to as that. And I think I became interested in Russian history in particular, as a way of trying to understand how the 20th century happened. I think that the relationship between the Soviet Union and America was the prime the prime mover of at least the second half of the 20th century, and trying to understand the larger world that one is born into and comes of age in. Felt like, I don't know, a not bad thing to do with one's time in school. So I guess that's the more serious answer. The other one though would be, I went to college in Los Angeles, and I kind of wanted just to go to as far away from there as I could, and that happened to be Russia. As for what book I would recommend, I think that's tough. Maybe I'll recommend a couple. Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman is absolutely brilliant. He was a correspondent for Red Star, which was the Russian military, the Soviet military paper, and he ended up, he was in Stalingrad. He was, I believe, he went all the way to the Battle of Berlin, and he wrote, these various dispatches for the Red Star, and he decided, sort of on his own, to begin writing this novel, which he sort of saw as the War and Peace of the Second World War, and he ended up submitting it in the 1950s for publication, and Khrushchev read it, and Khrushchev said that this was so dangerous it couldn't be published for at least 300 years. And Khrushchev not only had the book put in a vault somewhere, and it's telling that Khrushchev didn't say, chuck this in the fire, we can't see, get rid of this, but that in 300 years, it would be relevant and important to read then, but not until then. And he also not only detained Grossman, but also Grossman's typewriter was arrested as well. So that's a very powerful book that I would highly recommend. And maybe also I would say Gogol's Dead Souls, which is a wonderful book that sort of looks at the absurdity of country life in Tsarist Russia.
Não há mais perguntas? Só para dizer que o Almas Mortas do Gogol está aí disponível para quem o quiser comprar, numa bela tradução recente. And thank you, Anthony, for being here, and thank you, Flad, for inviting us and still inviting American writers to are here with us. And please read this book, Czar, in Love and Tecno. And the next one is about to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.